All right, let's jump right in. The World Bank just released its new international debt report. And wow, it's a bombshell. Because on the surface, it looks like things might be getting better. But what this report shows is a record breaking debt crisis that's been quietly building underneath. So let's get into it.
The whole story of global debt right now can really be summed up with just one word: paradox. There's what seems to be happening, and then there's what's actually happening. And that gap, well, that's creating what the report calls a financial riptide. And it comes with a steep human cost.
And hey, don't just take my word for it. The World Bank's own chief economist, Indermit Gill, starts the entire report by highlighting this exact idea. He's basically saying, look closer, people, because what you think you see, that's not the whole story.
So what does this paradox actually look like? Well, on one side, you've got some good news, right? Inflation is finally starting to cool down. Those really punishingly high interest rates are beginning to ease up. And this is a big one: international bond markets are open for business again. That gives countries a little bit of breathing room. But, and this is a huge but, for most developing nations, that's just a small comfort. The bad news is that the economic shocks from the last few years have created that financial riptide we talked about, leading to really grave setbacks and a pretty devastating human toll.
Okay, so let's try to put a number on this problem. Just how big is this financial riptide we're really talking about?
Here it is. In 2024, the total external debt for low and middle-income countries hit an absolutely staggering new record: $8.9 trillion. I mean, just try to wrap your head around a number that big. It's a mind-boggling amount of financial pressure on the entire global system. Now, let's break this down a bit. Most of it, you'll see, is long-term debt. But the really, truly alarming part is that last line. A record $1.2 trillion of this debt is owed by the world's 78 most vulnerable nations. These are the countries that the World Bank's IDA program is specifically set up to help. So we're talking about record debt at the absolute worst possible time for the world's poorest people. And there's also been this massive shift in who is actually doing the borrowing. If you looked at this a decade ago, it was about a 50-50 split between governments and the private sector. But today, a full 60% of that long-term debt is public. What that means is governments are the ones shouldering more and more of this burden to pay for everything from roads to schools.
So we know how much is owed, but the report makes it super clear that the story has also completely changed on the other side of the equation: who the money is actually owed to. And this is such a critical piece of the puzzle. The tools we have right now to handle major debt crises, they're totally outdated. I mean, they were designed for a world that just doesn't exist anymore. With a completely different set of lenders, they are just not up to the job.
Think about it like this. In the past, when a country got into financial trouble, most of its debt was owed to what we call official creditors. So a handful of wealthy governments and big institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. You could actually get the key players in a room together and hash out a deal. It was never easy, of course, but it was at least manageable. Today, that picture is completely flipped on its head. Private creditors, and we're talking about millions of basically anonymous bondholders all over the world, they now hold nearly 60% of all the long-term public debt. The old guard, the Paris Club of Government Creditors, they hold a tiny 7%. So you can see the problem, right? You can't just get everyone in a room anymore. The power is scattered all over the place, which makes trying to restructure debt a slow, chaotic, and frankly, messy process.
So this brings us to the real-world impact. What does this massive, super complicated debt burden actually mean for people on the ground?
It means this number right here. In 2024, developing countries paid out a staggering $205.1 billion more than they received in new loans. Just let that sink in for a second. For the third year in a row, more money is flowing out of these struggling economies than is flowing in. This is the biggest debt-related outflow of cash in more than half a century. So the big question is, where is all that money going? Well, a huge chunk of it is just to cover the interest payments. And yep, here's another record from the report: $415 billion spent on interest payments. And remember, that's not even paying down the actual debt. That's just the cost of borrowing. It's like treading water. This is the opportunity cost, plain and simple. Every single dollar spent on interest is a dollar that can't be spent on, well, let's see what the report says. The report puts it in really stark terms. This isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. This is real money that could have been used for schools, for hospitals, for basic infrastructure like electricity in rural villages. The human cost of these massive interest payments is just absolutely devastating.
So, with their backs against the wall, how are these countries trying to cope? Well, their strategies are now creating a whole new set of risks for the future.
I mean, countries are trying everything they can think of. They're trying to restructure their debt, renegotiate the terms, but there's one strategy that really stands out as a major new trend. They're shifting away from borrowing on the international market, and they're looking inward to their own economies.
And the data really backs this up. In a clear majority of the countries the World Bank looked at, governments are borrowing more and more from their own domestic banks. They're essentially trying to find money at home to fill those big financing gaps.
Now, doing this has one huge advantage. Borrowing in your own currency protects you from all the wild swings of the US dollar. But there's a massive downside. When governments suck up all the available local credit, it crowds out the private sector. There's just less money left over for local businesses to borrow, to invest, and crucially, to create jobs.
The report calls this a devil's bargain, and it really is. These countries are facing an impossible choice. Option 1, borrow from foreign bondholders at sky-high interest rates. Option B, borrow from your own banks and risk completely choking off your own private sector. There are just no good options on the table. And this brings us to the final, really haunting question from the World Bank's chief economist. Is that little bit of good news we started with, the easing inflation and interest rates, is it just a temporary distraction? Is it lulling countries into a false sense of security? Maybe encouraging them to just sleepwalk into an even bigger debt disaster down the road? According to this report, well, that's the trillion-dollar question.